I remember the morning of the will reading with painful clarity. The late April sunshine streaming through the law office windows felt like a mockery of our collective grief. It had been just 2 weeks since my mother's passing, and the hollowness in my chest had become a familiar companion. At 55, I wasn't supposed to be an orphan yet. That's what I kept thinking as I sat in the leather chair, my silver-white hair swept into a neat bun at the nape of my neck. My mother had always loved my premature white hair, calling it my crown of wisdom. She'd started going grey at 30, and I'd followed the same path. By 50, my dark brown had surrendered completely to a luminous white that turned heads at the grocery store and prompted strangers to ask if I'd coloured it. No, I always answered with a small smile. Just blessed. With good genes, good genes. The irony of that phrase would soon become apparent. Julian Mercer, my mother's attorney for over 30 years, sat across from us at his mahogany desk. His face was solemn as he adjusted his reading glasses. My brother David sat to my left, his wife Patricia beside him. My sister Rebecca occupied the chair to my right, her husband Thomas having stayed home with their children. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. "Before we begin," Julian said, "I want to express my deepest condolences. Eleanor was not just a client, but a dear friend." I nodded, grateful for his kindness. My mother had been many things too. Many people, a respected English professor, a community volunteer, a devoted grandmother, but most of all she had been our cornerstone. At 82 she had remained sharp and independent until the stroke that took her in her sleep. "Eleanor's will is straightforward," Julian continued. "The house in Brookhaven will be sold and the proceeds divided equally among her 3 children. Her personal possessions are to be distributed according to this list." He handed each of us a typed sheet of paper. My eyes scanned the familiar items. Mother's pearl necklace was coming to me, her collection of first editions to David, her watercolor paintings to Rebecca. There were no surprises. Additionally, Julian went on, there is a sum of approximately $215,000 from her investments and savings to be divided equally among you. David nodded, his face expressionless. My brother had always been the practical one, the financial advisor who managed not only his client's money, but also kept an eye on Mother's investments. Rebecca dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Of the 3 of us, she had been closest to our mother, visiting her several times a week with her children. "There is one more item," Julian said, reaching into a drawer. "Eleanor left specific instructions that this letter be read today." My heart skipped. A letter. Mother had never mentioned leaving a letter. Julian removed an envelope from a folder. The paper yellowed with age. It had been sealed with wax, an old-fashioned touch that was so characteristic of my mother. "She requested that I read this aloud to all of you," Julian said, breaking the seal carefully. The room fell silent as he unfolded the letter. I noticed his brow furrow slightly as he scanned the contents before beginning. "My dear children," he read, "if you are hearing this, then I have passed from this world, hopefully having lived a full life and having made amends where I could. There is, however, one truth I have never had the courage to share with you in life, though it has weighed on my conscience for over 50 years. I felt a chill run through me. David leaned forward in his chair. Rebecca's hand found mine and squeezed. "David," Julian continued, "you have always believed that Richard Williams was your father, as stated on your birth certificate. This is not the truth." The air seemed to vanish from the room. I stared at Julian, then at my brother, whose face had drained of color. "Your biological father was James Harrington, a colleague of mine at the university. Our affair was brief, but consequential. Richard never knew, and I beg your forgiveness for this deception." David's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. Patricia placed her hand on his arm, her expression stunned. Julian paused, visibly uncomfortable, before continuing. "Catherine," he read my name and my blood turned to ice. "You were born not 9 months after my honeymoon with Richard, as I've always claimed, but 8 months after a night I spent with Thomas Calloway, a graduate student who later moved to Europe. Richard loved you as his own, never questioning your early arrival." I couldn't breathe. The room tilted around me as 55 years of identity collapsed like a house of cards. Not my father's daughter. It couldn't be true. I had his eyes, everyone said so. I had his love of sailing, his distaste for cilantro, his tendency to hum when concentrating. Rebecca, Julian's voice seemed to come from far away now, you alone are Richard's biological child, though he loved all three of you equally and without distinction. He went to his grave never knowing these truths, and for that I am both grateful and ashamed. Rebecca had gone rigid beside me, her hand now limp in mine. I have lived with these secrets far too long, Julian finished reading. I could not leave this world without setting the record straight, though I know this revelation will cause pain. Please forgive me, and please know that regardless of biology, we were a family in every way that matters. All my love always, Eleanor Williams. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on Julian's bookshelf, the distant sound of traffic outside, the rush of blood in my ears. David was the first to speak. "This is bullshit," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Absolute bullshit." Patricia murmured something to him, but he shook her off. "Our father died thinking we were his children," he continued, his voice rising. "She let him die believing a lie." Rebecca had started to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would she tell us this now? What good does it do?" I couldn't form words. My mind was racing, recalculating. Every memory, every family story, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been moments when Mother looked at me differently? Had there been hesitation when people commented on my resemblance to Richard Williams? "Is there any way to verify this?" Patricia asked Julian. The attorney looked deeply uncomfortable. "Eleanor didn't provide any evidence beyond this letter. These are simply her statements." "DNA testing," David said abruptly. "We can do DNA testing." "But Father was cremated," Rebecca said. "And these men, James and Thomas, we don't even know if they're still alive." "James Harrington died in 2007, Julian said quietly. "I handled Eleanor's correspondence regarding his estate. As for Thomas Calloway, I have no information." I finally found my voice. "Julian, did you know about this before today?" He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I had no knowledge of the contents of this letter until just now, Catherine. Eleanor sealed it years ago and left it in my keeping." Another silence fell. Outside, a car horn blared. "I need some air," I said suddenly, rising from my chair. My legs felt unsteady beneath me. "Kathy, wait." Rebecca reached for me, but I was already moving toward the door. "I'll call you both later," I managed to say. I need to think." The hallway outside Julian's office was mercifully empty. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. 55 years of identity, shattered in seconds by a letter from beyond the grave. My mother's final words hadn't been of love or guidance, but a confession that turned my world inside out. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, one thought kept circling in my mind. Why now? Why tell us at all? What possible purpose could this revelation serve, other than to destroy the family she claimed to love? I stepped outside into the spring air, but it no longer felt warm. A chill had settled in my bones that I suspected would take a very long time to thaw. The week following the will reading passed in a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. David wasn't speaking to anyone, not to Rebecca, not to me, not even to Patricia, according to the brief, strained conversation I had with my sister-in-law. Rebecca had thrown herself into caring for her children, a deliberate distraction from the bombshell that had destroyed our understanding of ourselves. And me. I wandered my Portland apartment like a ghost, moving from room to room without purpose. I'd taken a leave of absence from the architectural firm where I was a partner, unable to focus on building designs when the very foundation of my life had crumbled. "You need to eat something," my friend Margot said, setting a bowl of soup in front of me at my kitchen table. She had been checking on me daily, bringing food I barely touched and concern I couldn't reciprocate. "I'm not hungry," I replied, but picked up the spoon anyway. "Have you talked to your siblings yet?" I shook my head. "David's gone completely dark. Rebecca texts to check in, but we're not really talking about it. It being the letter, the revelation, the betrayal." "You?" No, Margot said carefully. People had different values back then, different expectations. Your mother was young, living in a time when— When what? I interrupted. When it was okay to lie to your husband and children for 50 years? To let your husband go to his grave never knowing the truth? To drop this bomb after you're safely dead and don't have to deal with the fallout? Margot said nothing, just watched me with sad eyes. I'm sorry, I said after a moment. I know you're trying to help. What are you going to do now? She asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding. What was there to do? The past couldn't be changed. My father, the man I'd called father, had been dead for 15 years. According to Julian, James Harrington was also gone. As for Thomas Calloway, my supposed biological father, he was a ghost, a name without a face. I think I'm going to try to find him, I said, surprising myself. Find who? Thomas Calloway, the man my mother claims is my biological father. Margot looked skeptical. After all this time, would that help or just open more wounds? I don't know, I admitted. But I need answers, Margot. I need to understand why she did this. That evening I began my search. As an architect, I was methodical by nature, approaching problems with logic and structure. I started with the basics. Thomas Calloway, graduate, student at Bennington College in Vermont in the late 1960s, presumably in English literature, since that was my mother's department. A search of the college's alumni database yielded nothing useful. I found mentions of a Thomas Calloway who had graduated in 1969, but no contact information, no photographs. Mother's letter said he had moved to Europe. But where? When exactly? Had he married, had other children? Did he even know about me? After 3 hours of fruitless searching, I closed my laptop in frustration. This was a needle in a global haystack. My phone rang, startling me. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. Becca, I answered, trying to sound normal. How are you? Found something, she said without preamble. In Mom's desk, I was clearing out her study today, and there was a false bottom in the top drawer. My heart began to race. What was in it? Letters, photographs, a journal. Her voice was tight. Kathy, she wasn't lying. Everything in the letter, and it's all documented here. The room seemed to tilt again. Bring them over, I said. Now. An hour later, Rebecca sat across from me at my kitchen table, a weathered shoebox between us. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements jerky with tension. Have you shown these to David? I asked. She shook her head. He's not answering my calls either. I thought we should look through them first, together. I nodded, reaching for the box. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small leather-bound journal, and a manila envelope that proved to contain photographs. With trembling hands, I lifted out the first bundle of letters. They were from James Harrington to Way. Our mother, dating from 1966 to 1968. Love letters, passionate and literate, as one might expect from an English professor. I handed them to Rebecca, unable to read more than a few lines of the intimate correspondence. The journal was more revealing. In her neat, precise handwriting, our mother had documented her affairs, her fears, her guilt. She wrote of her love for our father, but also of her restlessness, her sense of being trapped in the role of faculty wife and mother. She wrote of James's intelligence and ambition, of Thomas's youth and artistic temperament. Listen to this, Rebecca said, reading from an entry dated March 1970. Thomas left for London today. He doesn't know about the baby, and I've decided not to tell him. He has his whole life ahead of him, and this child will have Richard, who will be a far better father than a 24-year-old poet with no prospects. This secret is my burden to bear. I closed my eyes, imagining my mother writing those words, making that decision for all of us. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. And here, Rebecca continued, flipping forward several pages, David is the spitting image of James, though Richard doesn't seem to notice. Perhaps he sees what he wants to see. I look at my son and feel both love and terror that my secret will be discovered. Stop, I said. Please. Rebecca closed the journal. There's more, Kathy, much more. She writes about you, about me, about how she almost told Dad several times but couldn't bear to hurt him. So she waited until they were both dead to hurt us instead, I said bitterly. We turned to the photographs next. There was one of a young man with dark curly hair and intense eyes, James Harrington, according to the inscription on the back, and another of a slim young man with light hair falling across his forehead, seated on a campus bench with a notebook open on his lap. Thomas, Spring 1970, my mother's handwriting noted on the reverse. I stared at the image, searching for myself. In his features, the shape of the eyes perhaps, the straight nose? It was impossible to tell from such an old faded photograph. What are we supposed to do with all this? Rebecca asked, her voice small. I had no answer. We sat in silence, the physical evidence of our mother's deception spread out between us. Finally, I reached for the photograph of Thomas Calloway again. I'm going to find him, I said. If he's still alive, I'm going to find him. Rebecca looked alarmed. Why? What good will that do? I don't know, I admitted. But I need to see him. I need to know where I came from. You came from here, Rebecca said fiercely. From this family, from Mum and Dad. Yes, Dad, regardless of biology. From growing up with David and me in that house in Brookhaven. That's where you came from, Kathy. I knew she was right in a way, and yet I'm still going to look for him, I said. The next morning, armed with the photograph and what little information I had gleaned from my mother's journal, I renewed my search with purpose. Thomas had been a poet, apparently. Had he published anything? A deeper internet search revealed a small collection of poetry published in London in 1975 by a T.C. Calloway. The book was long out of print, but I found a used copy available from a bookseller in Edinburgh. I ordered it immediately, paying an exorbitant sum for expedited shipping. My next breakthrough came 3 days later, when the poetry book arrived. Inside the front cover was a brief author biography. T.C. Calloway was born in Massachusetts and educated at Bennington College. After relocating to London in 1970, he worked as a translator and teacher while pursuing his writing. He currently lives in Florence, Italy. Florence. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. I booked a flight to Italy for the following week. You're insane, David said when I finally reached him by phone to tell him my plans. It was the first time we'd spoken since the will reading. What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish? I don't know, I said honestly. But I need to do this, David. Well, I don't, he replied. As far as I'm concerned, Richard Williams was my father. Biology doesn't change that. I'm not interested in digging up the past or meeting some stranger who happens to share my DNA. I understand, I said, though I didn't, not really. How could he just accept this and move on? But I need to do this for myself. Then do it, he said, his voice cold. But don't expect me to pick up the pieces if it blows up in your face. The call ended on that sour note, leaving me more determined than ever. David might be content to bury this revelation, but I couldn't. I needed answers, and Florence seemed to be where I might find them. As my departure date approached, I found myself experiencing a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. What would I say to this man if I found him? Hello, I might be your daughter. Would he even believe me? Would he care? The night before my flight, I sat on my balcony overlooking the lights of downtown Portland, the shoebox of my mother's secrets open beside me. I lifted out the photograph of Thomas Calloway again, studying the young face for clues to my own. In the fading light, I could almost convince myself that there was a resemblance in the set of the jaw, the slight arch of the eyebrows. Or perhaps I was seeing what I wanted to see, just as Richard Williams had done all those years ago. Florence in May was achingly beautiful, the Renaissance city bathed in golden light that softened the ancient stones and glinted off the Arno River. Under different circumstances, I would have reveled in the architecture, the art, the sense of history that permeated every cobblestone street. Instead, I moved through the city with single-minded purpose, the address in my notebook like a talisman. It had taken 3 days of detective work to locate Thomas Calloway. The poetry book had been my starting point, leading me to a small literary magazine that had published his work as recently as 2018. An email to the editor, claiming to be a researcher studying American expatriate poets, had yielded a response. Signor Calloway occasionally attends our readings at Café Letterario. on Via dei Neri. I believe he still lives in the apartment above the old bookstore in Piazza Santa Croce. And so I found myself standing in that piazza, gazing up at a weathered building with green shutters and a faded sign announcing Libri Antichi above a small storefront. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the separate entrance that presumably led to the apartments above. There were 3 buzzers beside the door. The middle one was labelled T. Calloway in faded ink on yellowed paper. I stood frozen, my finger hovering over the button. What was I doing here? What right did I have to disrupt this man's life with my questions, my need for answers? Perhaps David had been right. Perhaps some secrets should remain buried. Before I could retreat, the door to the bookstore opened, and an elderly man emerged, locking the door behind him. He was tall and thin, with a shock of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore linen pants and a light blue shirt, open at the collar. As he turned, he noticed me standing there. "Posso aiutarla?" he asked in Italian. "Can I help you?" I stared at him, unable to speak. Even after 55 years, I recognized him from the photograph. The youthful features had aged, of course, but the eyes were the same. A clear, thoughtful blue. "I'm looking for Thomas Calloway," I managed to say in English. He tilted his head slightly. "I am Thomas Calloway." His accent was American, barely colored by decades of living abroad. "And you are?" "My name is Catherine Williams," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have reason to believe that you knew my mother, Eleanor Williams, at Bennington College in the late 1960s. His expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his features before they settled into careful neutrality. "Eleanor," he repeated. "Yes, I knew her a lifetime ago. May I speak with you?" I asked. "It's important." He regarded me for a long moment, then nodded. "There's a cafe around the corner. We can talk there." The cafe was small and dim, with only a few patrons at that mid-afternoon hour. We sat at a table in the corner, 2 espressos between us. Thomas, I couldn't think of him as anything else yet, certainly not as father, studied me with open curiosity. "You look like her," he said finally. "Around the eyes. I had always thought I looked like Richard." The comment unsettled me. "My mother died 6 weeks ago," I said. "I'm sorry to hear that," he replied, and seemed to mean it. "She was a remarkable woman." At her will reading, her attorney read a letter she had left, I continued, deciding direct honesty was the only approach. In it, she revealed that my father, the man I grew up believing was my father, was not my biological parent. I paused, watching his face. "She named you as my biological father." Thomas Calloway went very still. The ambient sounds of the cafe, quiet. Conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups, seemed to fade away. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. I didn't. "I see," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "And you came all this way to tell me this?" "I came all this way for answers," I replied. "Did you know? About me?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Eleanor and we were together. Briefly. When I left for London, we had already ended things. She never contacted me afterward. So you had no idea that she was pregnant?" "None whatsoever." He took a sip of his espresso, his hand perfectly steady. "How old are you, Catherine?" 55. He did the math in his head. "Born in 1970 then." I nodded. "And you've lived your whole life believing Richard Williams was your father?" "Yes." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "Why would Eleanor reveal this now, after all these years?" "That's one of the questions I came to ask you," I said. "It makes no sense to me. Richard died 15 years ago, never knowing the truth. Why not take this secret to her grave? Why tell us now when it can only cause pain?" "Us?" Thomas asked sharply. I realized I hadn't explained the full situation. "My brother David is apparently the biological son of a professor named James Harrington. Only my sister Rebecca is Richard's biological child." Thomas let out a long breath. "My God! Eleanor always did have a flair for the dramatic, but this—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry. This must be incredibly difficult for you." The simple acknowledgement of my pain unlocked something in me. To my horror, I felt tears welling. In my eyes. I had not cried since the will reading, not in front of Julian, not with Rebecca, not even alone in my apartment. But now, sitting across from this stranger, who was supposedly my father, the dam broke. "I don't know who I am anymore," I said, my voice cracking. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, it feels like a lie." Thomas reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His touch was tentative, gentle. "You are still who you've always been," he said. "Your memories, your experiences, your connections, those are real, Catherine. Biology is just one small part of what makes us who we are." "That's what my sister said," I replied, wiping at my tears with my free hand. "She sounds wise," Thomas said with a small smile. We sat in silence for a moment, his hand still resting lightly on mine. I studied his face, searching for similarities. The shape of his hands, perhaps, long-fingered like mine, the height, the slender build. But these were superficial things, coincidences, perhaps. "I have so many questions," I said finally. "I can imagine," he replied. "I'll answer what I can, though I suspect I have fewer answers than you're hoping for." "Tell me about you and my mother," I said. "How did you meet? What was your relationship like?" Thomas withdrew his hand and sat back, his gaze turning inward with memory. "I was her student, initially, a graduate assistant in the English department. She was brilliant, incisive, passionate about literature. I was young and impressionable, dazzled by her mind." He paused. "The relationship was inappropriate, of course. She was married, for one thing, and my professor for another, but we were drawn to each other." "Did you love her?" I asked. His smile was sad. "I thought I did. At 24, it's easy to confuse admiration and desire with love. In retrospect, I think what I loved was the idea of her, the sophisticated, intellectual woman who saw something special in me. But did I know her truly? I'm not sure anyone did. I thought of my mother's journal, her descriptions of feeling trapped, restless. Were you aware she was unhappy in her marriage?" "She presented it that way," Thomas said carefully. "She spoke of Richard as a good man, but conventional, unimaginative. She felt stifled, she said, in need of intellectual and emotional stimulation he couldn't provide." He hesitated. "But I was getting only one side of the story, of course, and I was young, enough to believe I could be her salvation." "What happened? Why did you leave?" "I received a fellowship to study in London. Eleanor encouraged me to take it, insisted, actually. She said I had potential that would never be realized if I stayed at Bennington." He shrugged. "When I left, we agreed to end things. It was presented as a mutual decision, though in hindsight I think she had tired of me. I absorbed this, trying to reconcile this version of my mother with the woman I had known, steady, principled, devoted to her family. Had that all been a facade? Or had she genuinely changed, grown into the person I remembered?" "And after you left?" I asked. "You never returned to the States?" "Not to Vermont. I visited my parents in Massachusetts occasionally, until they passed. But I made my life here in Europe. I taught English literature at universities in London and Paris before settling in Florence. I published some poetry, did translations, eventually opened the bookstore downstairs. Did you ever marry? Have children?" The question felt strange on my tongue. "I married once to an Italian woman named Sophia. We divorced after 10 years. No children." He looked at me directly. "Until now, apparently. The reality of our situation seemed to settle over us both then. This man was, in all likelihood, my biological father. Half of my genetic makeup came from him, and yet he was a stranger." "I brought something," I said, reaching into my bag. I withdrew the photograph of him as a young man and slid it across the table. His eyebrows rose as he picked it up. "Where did you get this?" "My mother kept it, along with letters, a journal, documentation of her relationships." "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the photo. I nodded and he turned it over, examining the inscription on the back. A shadow crossed his face. "She kept this all these years," he murmured, "and yet never told me about you." "Are you angry?" I asked. "That she didn't tell you?" He considered the question seriously. "I'm regretful," he said finally. To have missed your childhood, your growing up. To be meeting you now when we're both essentially formed. Yes, there's some anger there at being denied the choice to know you, but mostly I feel regret for what might have been. It was the answer I hadn't known I needed to hear, acknowledgement that my existence mattered, that knowing me might have been worth something to him. Would you have wanted to know, I pressed, if she had told you she was pregnant? Yes, he said without hesitation. I would have wanted to know. What I would have done with that information, whether I would have been a good father, whether I would have returned to the States or asked her to join me in London, that I can't say. But I would have wanted the chance to try. We talked for hours. As the cafe filled with the evening crowd, we moved to a small restaurant nearby, continuing our conversation over pasta and wine. Thomas told me about his life, his work, his travels. I told him about my career in architecture, my brief marriage, in my 30s that had ended amicably but childlessly, my home in Portland. We carefully avoided making plans or promises. This was a reconnaissance mission, not a reunion. We were still strangers connected by biology and a mutual sense of having been wronged by Eleanor Williams. As the evening wound down, Thomas walked me back to my hotel. We stood awkwardly on the sidewalk outside, neither quite sure how to end this extraordinary encounter. How long are you staying in Florence? He asked. My flight back is in 3 days, I replied. He nodded. Perhaps we could meet again tomorrow. I could show you some of the city. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Catherine, he said, hesitating, I don't know what happens from here. I don't know what place, if any, you want me to have in your life. But I'm glad you found me. So am I said, and realized it was true. Back in my hotel room, I called Rebecca. It was early morning in Portland, but she answered on the second ring. Kathy, is everything okay? I found him, I said simply. Oh my God, she breathed. And? He didn't know about me, I said. Mother never told him she was pregnant. He's been living in Florence all these years, running a bookstore. He seems kind, thoughtful. I paused. He has my hands. Oh, Kathy, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. What now? I don't know, I admitted. We're meeting again tomorrow. I'm not looking for a father, Becca. I had a father, but maybe... I trailed off, not sure how to articulate what I was feeling. Maybe there's room for knowing him anyway, she finished for me. Yes, I said. Exactly. After we hung up, I stood at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the Florence skyline, the dome of the Duomo silhouetted against the night sky. I thought of my mother, her secrets, her choices. I thought of Richard Williams, the man who had raised me, taught me to sail, helped me with my math homework, walked me down the aisle at my wedding. I thought of Thomas Calloway, the poet who shared my DNA and who, through no choice of his own, was now connected to me. The anger I had, carried since the will reading, hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted somehow. In its place was something more complex, grief for what had been lost, curiosity about what might be found, and perhaps just beginning to form a tentative forgiveness. Not for my mother's deception, that would take more time if it ever came, at all, but forgiveness for the young woman she had been, making difficult choices in a different era, and forgiveness for myself, for the feelings of betrayal and confusion that had driven me across an ocean in search of answers. As I prepared for bed, I realized that Thomas had been right about one thing. I was still who I had always been. My history had been rewritten, but not erased. And perhaps in finding this new connection, I might eventually find my way back to understanding the mother I thought I had known. The letter had shattered our family in seconds, but maybe, just maybe, the pieces could be reassembled into something new, different from what had been before, but whole in its own way. Tomorrow I would walk the streets of Florence with the man who had unknowingly given me half of who I was. And then I would go home to Portland, to the life I had built, to the siblings who shared my confusion and pain, to the process of reconciling what I had learned with what I had lived. The truth was complicated, messy, painful. But it was the truth, and after 55 years of unknowing, that would have to be enough.